Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you for coming to this topic this morning. You have this option to go elsewhere. I hope you won't be disappointed here. I'm going to talk to you about dilapidations. I suppose when you think about it, the term dilapidation is a very unusual term. If you're not in the field of dilapidations, it may as well be a foreign language. You can imagine being out for dinner with a few friends and saying that you're involved in the area of dilapidations. I'm sure you'd have some job explaining exactly what it is that you do. So I wanted to start off by looking at the dictionary definition of dilapidation. You take the word to dilapidate, it means to become or make something become partially ruined or decayed, especially through neglect. So it still doesn't sound very interesting. But I've spent the last 20 years working in the field of dilapidations, and believe you me, it's an extremely interesting and challenging field to work in as such. It throws up a lot of challenges that keeps us on our toes as surveyors on an ongoing basis. So the number of statements that I've come up with over the time, not the type of statements you'll find in the textbook, but things that would hopefully either to help to serve or either help the situation to you or maybe even confuse you more. But firstly, the whole thing of dilapidation is a very simple statement, but it's nothing to do with common sense. It's about a legal interpretation of a standard of repair of a building, and more often than not, it's not the right thing to do. So it doesn't necessarily make common sense, the answer that you're going to end up with. And secondly, there's very often no right answer. I can find myself one day acting for a landlord, putting a case forward, and the next day I'm acting for a tenant, putting the exact opposite case forward as well. So there's ways of interpreting it. I just hope that when I'm doing that, I'm not dealing with the same surveyors, or if I am, that they've forgotten the argument to put forward since the last time. I want to try and keep the best case forward. And the third thing really is that dilapidations really can be likened to a game of cards, albeit a very serious game of cards, but you're trying to play the right cards at the right time. You've got to develop a strategy with a view to getting the best deal possible for your own client. So what I want to do is to take you through the principle of dilapidations, but there's a lot of emphasis on my own personal experience over the years. So I want to home in on a number of important topics that have come up and are likely to come up in the future and how these are dealt with. I'm going to take you through some case studies that I'm involved with on a day-to-day basis as well. So I suppose, again, just to look at the next thing, I want to look at the changes that have happened in the whole field of dilapidations. And I think when I look at it over 20 years, the biggest thing that I've noticed is the growth in the building surveying department. That's the building surveying members of the Society of Chartered Surveyors. When I first came back to Ireland, I studied in England. I was the 5th chartered building surveyor here. The 4 before me are no longer practicing, so I'm the longest serving building surveyor in the Republic at this stage. But since that, we have about 240 or 250 chartered building surveyors at the moment. The relevance of that statement really is that building surveyors are specifically trained in the area of dilapidation. So we get formal education and training as to how to actually deal with it and what comes up as such. And what I'm finding is that very often, we're up against architects, engineers, project managers, whatever it is, and they have no specific experience. So it's obviously helpful when you've got that training in ahead of it as such. So in many ways, I'd say we were spoiled in the early days because you were able to bring up things and put your case forward, and you find that your counterpart, because they weren't well versed in the situation, they weren't able to give a good response. So very simply, they wouldn't know to read the lease. So they were lost before they ever started. They weren't able to refer to the lease document. And the corollary of that is that if you look at it nowadays, more often than not, I find myself dealing with an opposite number, which would be a building surveyor. And if you have 2 building surveyors dealing with the dilapidations case, it should be a straightforward situation and it should be possible to cut to the chase very quickly. So the other big thing really to highlight is the SESI guidance note to best practice. That is something that we had for years in the UK. It was a guidance note document, and over the last 2 years, the Society of Chartered Surveyors set up a working group, and there's 3 or 4 of us involved in that, which set up a document which identifies the best ways of dealing with dilapidations. And it's a very useful tool, and anybody that's going to be working in dilapidations does need to be familiar with it and should follow the guidance document as such. It's not actually cast in stone as such, but certainly does set out the best way of dealing with it. So this is just really to, and I say on that slide, the current declining market, this slide was prepared some time ago. Thankfully, my experience is we're not declining at the moment. We're seeing to be on the rise again. That's certainly from the experience in Dublin, and I hope it will extend throughout the country as such. But I found that with the experience of a declining market, we had to adapt and change to deal with the situation as it arises. And we were finding that it was probably better to write off a dilapidations claim to get a tenant to stay on the building, because the real value is in getting a rental roll. On the other hand, you had situations where you had leases coming to an end and tenants simply couldn't afford to deal with the dilapidation. So from a landlord's perspective, you're forecasting forward, you have a tenant moving out in 3 years. There's no point in waiting to the end of the lease to get the dilapidations done. You need to be bringing that forward sooner rather than later. So now I want to look at the basic principles of dilapidations. It hasn't actually changed in 20 years. The basic principles are the same. I'll just start off with saying, firstly, what is a schedule of dilapidations? So basically, it's a document which sets out the works that a tenant is required in order to comply with the repairing obligation of his or her lease. I think it's a unique term. It's no special status in law, but very often out there when I'm dealing with the market, you'll have all sorts of terms used from schedules of conditions, schedules of works, whatever. And really, it's, when you're in the field of dilapidations, it's very much just the term that's used specifically relating to landlord and tenant defects as such. This all sounds very simple, and in many ways it should be, but in reality, you have two very different or opposing views out there on the situation: the landlord's view and the tenant's view. Like, the landlord would be able to view that the building is reinstated to first-class condition, whereas the tenant of the view just needs a lick of paint. And that's there really are opposing views. So I'm just going to give you an example of an actual. I hope you can read that from the back, but the actual repairing clause there, which I'll leave you to read yourself, but basically that's what it says. It's very simple and straightforward to repair and keep the building in and all additions in good and tenable order, repair and condition. But the landlord would interpret that clause very differently. The tenant will interpret it very differently as well, and it can be summarised into something that the landlord thinks the tenant is responsible for handing back something that's in pristine condition, that's not been damaged or neglected in any way, and the tenant basically interprets it as handing it back with a lick of paint. So you have very different views on that as such. Now, the real answer is that it's somewhere in between, and you need to look at the specific terms of the lease. As I say, it's understanding the terms of the lease, and you will get good guidance in the guidance note as to how that should be followed through as such. I'm going to give you some good examples of this in the case studies a little bit later. So the next thing I want to look at is, when should a schedule be served? There's basically two categories. A schedule can be served at any time, theoretically, after the lease has been signed, but in reality it boils down to interim schedules and terminal or final schedules. So from the day after a tenant signs a lease, you could get a schedule of dilapidation served on, but practically it's unlikely to arise until a number of years have elapsed. And likewise, the final or terminal schedule would be in the last year or two of the term. It can be in advance of the term ending, or it can be after the term ending. The next thing I want to look at is, why would you serve a schedule of dilapidations? There can be many reasons. The simple and most obvious one is at the end of term, the lease has expired and you want to serve the schedule. The tenant could be going to assign their interest to another tenant, and you want to make sure that they have complied with all their obligations, particularly if the new tenant is not of the same calibre. If you had a big multinational name letting it off to a smaller practice, you want to make sure you've got the repairs carried out before that happens. The big area would be the whole area of break options. There's a very important lease, if the tenant has an option to break the lease, that they hand it back in repair. Because simple things like a rent review, if the building's in poor condition, the landlord could lose out, so it's better to get the building repaired. So that might be an option or a reason to serve the schedule during the lease. And the reason is just to simply maintain the value of the interest. So the landlord is thinking of selling their asset on, the better condition the building is in, the better the value will be as such. The latter one is perhaps very significant, because the whole issue, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is the concept of diminution in value, which has the effect of reducing a dilapidations claim. So you can see there's many reasons there why a dilapidation schedule could be served, and I think it's very important from a surveyor's perspective when you're doing this, that the surveyor understands why it's required and what the reason for it is, because it'll set the tone for how you set out the whole procedure. Like, I could go out there and produce a 25-page document, or could just simply set out a list with 10 items, like the most crucial items that need to be done. So it can be a fully detailed document, or something that's kept short and to the point as such. The whole question of the timing of the service of the schedule is very important, and you need to consider, say, from a landlord's perspective, whether you want the works carried out or whether you want a financial settlement in lieu of it. So if the works have to be done, you must give enough time for the tenant to plan and organise those works, and time then to execute the works before the lease expiry. Very often I would hear tenants saying, you didn't give me the schedule of dilapidations, the lease terminates next month, and you just hand me a document now and there's 3 months' work. That's no defence. The obligation is on the tenant to yield the building up in repair, so it's up to them to establish their own responsibilities. The landlord can serve a schedule through the lease, but are not obliged to as such. So in drawing up scheduled dilapidations, you need to look at the information that a surveyor needs in order to do that. The first thing obviously needs a copy of the lease, and just to say, make sure it's an accurate lease that's a true copy, preferably a signed copy. It should also have maps attached to it, etc. You'd also look at the subleases, head leases can be very relevant in the whole situation. And just to be clear that you get a full copy of the lease. I often get landlords sending me over extracts from the lease, but you really do need the full lease to make sure there's nothing left out of it. You should also get copies of any licenses or consents in relation to any alterations or fit-out works, original drawings and photographs if possible. And sometimes the whole issue of schedules or conditions, if there's a condition schedule drawn up at the start of the lease which confirms the condition at a particular point in time. Any previous scheduled dilapidations that might have been served a number of years earlier, and any sort of structural engineers, M&E engineers reports on the building. So then you're on to the situation of preparing the schedule. So the surveyor then go out and you carry a full and detailed inspection of the premises. It's essential that you get into all parts of the building, onto the roof, into roof spaces, and get a very good picture of the condition of the building. The textbook might say to you that you should record only the defects that are relevant for incorporating within the schedule, but I'm of the view that you should record everything on site and you can make a later decision as to what goes into the schedule or not. The schedule itself is a precise document. I'm going to give you an example of that now. It should be a typical schedule here, and it's set out in the guidance documents to how it should be laid out. It's basically a precise document that consists of a list of specific instructions. Now, it should locate the defect, describe what the defect is, and state the action required. And it should also give reference to the clause that has actually been breached. So you can see that I've located, for example, the first item is the ceiling. I've said clause number 2.5 in the lease. I've stated what the defect is, and then the remedial action. The question of whether you put costings in or not depends on the timing of the schedule. If it's an end-of-term schedule and you're looking at the financial settlement, then it should contain costings. If it's an interim schedule, it would be inappropriate to put a costing on it, because really it's not of relevance to the landlord whether an item costs 1,000 or 5,000 to resolve. That's really an issue for the tenant. So the next thing really is specifically what does one include in the schedule, and this is perhaps the most crucial part of what I want to talk to you about, because it really is down to a question of experience and knowledge over the years that actually comes down in. But I have found, again, to my own terms, that a lot of things come under the responsibilities that I've defined as the R's. And the responsibility is to redecorate, to repair, to comply with regulations, and reinstatement. They're the four that you'll regularly come across. On a few occasions you'll come across the other two, which is to renew and rebuild, which are extremely onerous covenants. The odd time that it's creeping into some of the more modern leases, but the first four would be more the normal one as such. Just taking the one to redecorate, it's generally covered by a separate clause, and it's not necessarily defined within the word repair. So you could have a very onerous for repairing clause in a lease, but actually have no obligation to decorate the building unless there's actually a decoration clause. Now, that can be stretched to a point. If you had a damaged plaster on a wall and you had to hack off the plaster and renew it, I think you'd be caught for redecorating. But if the place was just generally protective order and no disrepair, then you couldn't ask a tenant to do that. Turning now to the repair issue, and this is the single biggest one really from a complexity point of view, because the whole issue of something to keep in repair, to put in repair, to leave in repair. And the question is there any difference in these statements? They are actually quite different, but the courts in England have defined that to keep something in repair, you must first put it into repair. So it is quite a complex area that needs a fair bit of understanding on that as such. Another issue that comes into the whole repair is the concept of fair wear and tear. Whether or not a tenant is only obliged to carry a certain level. And I would be of the view that unless there's a fair wear and tear exception in the lease, then the tenant is caught for a fairly onerous repairing obligation. So the best way really to look at this is to take a few examples. So I just want to look here at a roof. That's a typical sort of Georgian style building with a natural safe covered roof. And I said earlier about the importance of getting into all parts of the building. You're not going to see this from a casual inspection of the building. You've got to get up on the roof, see what's happening. You can see here the central valleys, the debris in the gutter. I've just showed a few of those photographs. When you look back, the parapet, the lead flashing is all off the place here. There's again plaster coming off the parapet walls, water lodging there, and there's another one here with some cracks in the lead when you look closely. So the question is, what's the level of repair that a tenant is going to be caught for here? And in reality, a tenant can be caught for very high onerous repairs, can involve complete re-roofing in terms of, that lead is now cracked and slates is going to have to be replaced. You have to strip back the slates to get in at it. So a tenant can be faced with a very, very high bill for something of that nature. And it gets very complex when you get into the whole area of protected structures. Maybe the previous repairs over the last 10 or 15 years were using fibre cement slates, or even in some cases the asbestos slates have all been patched throughout the roof. It's an inappropriate repair, so the repair must be appropriate to the type of building and can be made to undo all of these. Other things just in the roofing category is the whole area of asbestos roofs and warehouse buildings. And you get cracked sheets, and what's the satisfactory standard of repair here? Can you patch something over it? Can you replace the sheet? And I found situations where tenants are having to replace entire warehouse roofs on buildings because of the level of disrepair. Now, a lot of it will come down to, there's a concept we'll talk about later on, which is due regard to the age, character and location of the building. But if you have a lease with 10 or 15 years to run with an asbestos roof, the chances are the tenant will be caught for replacing that roof. So they might as well do it early rather than later, at least get the benefit of it. The other thing that's a little bit disappointing, I suppose, is the metal deck roofs. We're getting a lot of cut-edge corrosion on the joints. It's a very common problem. So buildings that are not even 10 years old, and this is the type of problem we're getting here. And tenants now having to touch up not only the edge of that decoration, but find themselves sometimes having to redecorate the entire surface of the roof. Seems very unfair on relatively new buildings, but that's what they've been landed with, etc. Just want to look at a few examples. The roof light's a very common one. The roof lights will have degraded and faded with time, and the tenants are commonly having to replace those at an average cost of €300 or €400 per roof light in a warehouse, and you can get quite a few of them throughout as such. Just want to look here at walls. Now, this wasn't a dilapidations case, but just want to set the standard when you get pyrites and all sorts of cracks arising in buildings. What is the responsibility attaching to the tenant? Again, more often than not, in a full repairing lease, the tenant will be responsible for that, inherent and latent defects. The other issue then is, I'm going to go through a few of these. So you can see here, this is where the whole wall in a factory was actually sliding out. You can see, if you look closely there, there's the thing has slipped out by 10 millimetres with the movement in the brickwork. Again, the tenant was caught for significant repairs in that building. The other ones looking at here is, I'm going to skip through the walls. I want to just to see some examples of walls that have completely collapsed outside on the grounds around the edge of the building, tenants caught for rebuilding, etc. You want to look at the oil stains in factory floors, another fairly significant issue where tenants are caught for the treatment that goes with this. Again, it's a fairly significant repairing obligation there. The other issue I want to look at is regulations. You'll often get a standard clause in the lease, which is to observe or comply with regulations throughout the course of the lease. But just to highlight that it's not a carte blanche for new regulations, because most regulations are not retrospective. The Fire Services Act was a retrospective act, we had to comply with it. But very often I would see landlords throwing in clauses now to, bring buildings up into compliance with building regulations, replace, put in modern alarms, all this kind of thing. That won't hold or won't work in more leases unless there's been a trigger action that would have brought that into play as such. The other big one I think maybe is the whole issue of reinstatement. And in practical terms, I would find that reinstatement is perhaps the single most expensive clause to comply with, because if you have an office that's subdivided into the boardroom, the kitchen, 3 or 4 offices, you take out the partitions and all your lighting has to be changed. You could end up having to rewire a place. So that would actually, from a cost point of view, push the whole issue of the repairs and redecorations into perspective as such. So I was conscious of the time. I don't have as much time as I'd like, so I'm going to skip through to some of these issues that I think. So I want to look at the principles that need to be applied for every single item when you actually go to do a schedule of dilapidations. You need to establish whether or not there's a breach of a covenant, and is there any damage to the building? Is it a failure to meet what a tenant would have expected at the start of that lease? Is it in disrepair? Is it within the demise? Very often you get things happening within the boundaries, or the driveways outside. Is that part of the lease, or did the lease just take in the building? Is the need to hand something back different? Is the cost of repair excessive? And then you have to ask yourself what's needed to repair the building, and that needs to all come out in the schedule of dilapidations as such. As regards the service of a schedule, it's normally done by a solicitor, but more and more frequently we're finding as surveyors we've been asked to do that. Then the next thing you just want to quickly look at is the whole issue of pricing and negotiating a schedule. So it's a separate exercise. You have the schedule prepared. You need then to price it only if there was going to be financial settlement in lieu of the works. If the tenant's going to do it, it's not that relevant as such. So the tenant would have the choice to either execute the works or make financial settlement. If it's going to be the financial settlement, it has to be priced up and enter into negotiation with a view to getting it sorted. Typically, the financial will include the cost of the works, the professional fees for organising and overseeing the works, also the professional fees that the landlord has incurred in preparing the schedule. And there'll also be VAT, but that depends on the VAT status of the landlord. If the landlord is VAT registered, generally he can be able to claim back the VAT, so he can't add that as a claim. and then you may be caught for loss of rent, rates and service charges, etc. as well. But that will only apply if the loss is related to the tenant's actions. If you are unable to let the building, you wouldn't be able to recover those issues. Just quickly run on to a tenant's response, because when a tenant gets a schedule, there is a chance that the document will have been prepared by somebody who either doesn't understand the situation and throws in everything, kitchen sink and the whole lot, or it could simply be building in a negotiating factor, as most of us would actually do anyway. So the tenant would generally want to get a response done out, and this is laid out in the guidance document. So effectively you're adding extra columns where the tenant sets out their detailed response, and they'll only put their cost down the right hand side as well. So let's move on here to it. I just want to take you through a few little concepts. I want to take the whole concept of negotiation. This would be a very typical situation. You look at a window, single glazed window in a building, where you have a broken pane of glass at the top, you have decay in the frame and poor deck at the border. Now the obligations are to repair that, not to replace it. But logic would dictate that the right thing to do is to replace that window. You get into the whole concept of, let's say it was €200 to repair that, but you could replace it for €400. You're actually better off from a landlord's perspective to get €150 in your back pocket towards replacing that window rather than €200 spent and was still a single glazed window. So really it's the whole principle of negotiations, and as I said to you at the very start, nothing to do with common sense. What you're responsible for is not necessarily the right thing, and this is what you need to be looking at. The other concept I wanted to look at was the whole concept of diminution in value. A landlord's claim is capped by the diminution in value. So in very simple language, that means that if you had a building in good repair worth €2 million, but in its current state of disrepair it's worth €1.8 million, there's no point in serving a schedule of dilapidations for 500,000 because you won't succeed. The claim would be capped at 200,000. Now it's a little bit simple, that statement, because it only relates to repairs. It doesn't include, let's say, willful neglect and other damage to the building. So it's time mark. Or? Okay. So I just want to look at the current and future trends as to what's actually happening. The dilapidations have been and are continuing to be a big thing because of old leases, which 99-year leases, 35-year leases, and all these leases are coming to an end. But leases that have been entered into the last 10 or 15 years, we've all become aware of it now. So there are ways and means of improving the situation. So it's now normal practice, and in fact, I would almost say almost compulsory to advise any tenant taking on a lease to have a schedule condition drafted up and to record the condition of the building and have it tied into the lease. There's no ambiguity as to what the standard of repair is. The other thing I found over the last few years is the whole concept of recognising the value of the tenant paying rent and how important is the dilapidations. I've showed some horror stories and I've seen tenants paying out major amounts of money in certain cases. But we've also managed to get situations where a tenant's signing up maybe to a 5-year lease. Well, if you actually lock into a 10-year lease, I want my dilapidations written off. I want to put in my boardroom, I want to put in the 3 offices, but we'll allow these to stay as part of the situation. It's a good value for the tenant going forward, because it costs almost as much to defit out a building as it does to fit it out. Just on this, the abilities required by the surveyor, you have to be able to diagnose the defects. You need to assess the appropriate methods of repair, a good knowledge of building costs. You have to have experience in the interpretation of lease, and a good understanding of case law and legal precedents, and again, the ability to negotiate, because a lot of this boils down to negotiation at the end of the day and trying to get the best case for your client as such. Now, I have a few case studies, but I don't mind really take 1 or 2 of them. Yeah. I was involved. I just took a random thing. I'm going to pick 1 or 2 out that might be most useful there. And I think the first one is probably a good one to start with. There was a situation where there was a subtenant issue. So the landlord and tenant had a case. The tenant agreed to pay out, the head tenant, that is, 75,000. And they assumed that that's great, we'll distribute this pro rata between the subtenants A and B, so it'll be 40,000 to one, 35,000 to the other. We can represent the subtenants, but we made the case that there was a right-of-way corridor through the 2 units to allow 2 separate occupancies. So the lease terms are very different. The head tenant was responsible for stripping out all the partitions and going back to an open plan office, and that had the knock-on effect of taking down the ceilings, the knock-on effect of changing the light fittings. But because it was a sub-lease, that didn't apply to the subtenants. So we were able to get the subtenants virtually off the hook for most of those dilapidations as such. Another one, I'm going to skip on that one. This was an interesting one. It was a tower block of offices. 10-year lease. It was originally subdivided into 14 offices, and we had a claim for €300,000 in that floor for stripping that back to an open plan office. We were lucky enough to be able to find the original letting brochure. It was only a 10-year-old lease, it wasn't too hard to get it. And we discovered that it was let with 14 offices in situ, and you could also see, and in fact the next photograph might show it, there was one style of partition which is a fairly modern partition, and there was you can see the difference in types of partitions anyhow. So we were able to prove that these partitions were in place, and we were able to get that claim right. But we offered them 10,000, and we ultimately got a tender, got prices in for €35,000. Now it's still unresolved. We actually wrote them a cheque for 55,000. They didn't take it, and the landlord, since in liquidations, was made a little bit more complex. So it's an unresolved case, but I've no doubt that it will end up that the tenant won't have to pay out too much for that. Just one final case I'm going to talk about is a head office for one of the major banking institutes. There's a multi-million-euro claim for dilapidations. We tried our best to settle it, but again, the typical situation where a lot of landlords are in a NAMA-type background. They wouldn't engage or cooperate with us. There was a fairly hefty cheque going to be written out. The building was advertised, put up for sale, and sold to a meat baron. We turned around and bought it with 7 or 8 million over and above the guide price. So we changed tact altogether and said, acting on the principle of loss, where is your loss, Mr. Landlord? There's no claim here. So we withdrew any offer, any settlement, and said there's no dilapidation settlement whatsoever. Now, interestingly, the old landlord is still pursuing it. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. It might hit the case, the courts yet, but we're hoping it won't. One final case, and then we'll leave it at that. A case in Ranelagh in Dublin, where it was a B&B. The 18 months thrown on the lease, and we decided that we wanted to enter into the tenant planning the dilapidations and the repairing obligations. We tried to engage with the landlord, refused to engage with us, so then down to 12 months thrown, we wrote and said we assessed our liability at €100,000. Within 24 hours, they obviously had their homework done. We got a claim back for €1 million, poles apart. We decided to do the works. The landlord injuncted us because he said we were cowboys, we were messing about and doing things we shouldn't be done. So that gets you a fast track situation into the courts, found ourselves in the courts, and the judge thankfully ruled in our favour and said, well, you're presupposing that we weren't going to do our things right. So the judge allowed us to get back into the building and do it. The landlord incurred the tenant incurred €60,000 fees in that process, which they were able to pass on to the landlord. And so the landlord could have had 100,000. We would have given 150,000 to make the problem go away, but he wouldn't deal with us. Lost out. We had works done, which I agree were not the most sensible things to do with the building, but they were in compliance with the legal interpretation of the lease. He ended up with a €60,000 bill from us, and no doubt a €60,000 bill on his own side as well. So just would have made sense to cooperate with us. I've lots of other cases there, but I know there's 2 other speakers which I'm not going to take up all the time on them. If there's any questions, I'm quite happy to take them. Yes.
Niall Mitchell from Blue Rock Environmental.
Yes.
Slightly off track from buildings, but what's your experience to date regarding to contamination and agreements, prior agreements and no agreements?
Well, contamination is a big issue, and I've been involved in a number of petrol stations and factories. I showed you an example of a factory there. Contamination tenants are responsible. They're responsible for the site in a full repairing lease, and huge bills have been faced with to decontaminate the grounds.
But in terms of my question was really to do with if a landlord hasn't engaged on a survey done prior to the agreement of the tenancy, and then at the end of the lease,
yes.
dispute regarding to
okay.
what?
It's a very good question. I'm glad you answered, because just a statement that I would throw out is that it is more onerous to be a tenant than it is to be a freeholder. More often as a freeholder you have an element of choice in terms of timing when you do things, how you go about it, and you have regulations to comply with. But a tenant taking on a leasehold, a full repairing lease, is actually taking on a greater liability than actually buying a building, because it's a legal interpretation to do something, and it's up to them to do a due diligence survey, otherwise they're caught for it. Yes, Fergal?
Let's say in the situation whereby a tenant takes a shell and core building,
yes.
as a case that is on cost,
yes.
The lease expires, it's in the landlord's interest, presumably, to retain the building as is, but it out.
Yes.
But can he obviously, under the lease agreement, insist, well, he can obviously, under the lease agreement, insist that it's put back together, or put back to a shell and core arrangement?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and in 20 years I haven't seen that happen. Okay, but you have to look at the lease and what the lease says and what the lease defines. So even though it's a very typical situation, you get the shell and core situation, the lease will then go on to describe what the responsibilities are, and that normally includes the suspended ceiling and the space above it and the cavity. It normally includes the raised floor and the space above it. You might have a query over the carpets, but you're actually signing up, even though you incur the cost as a tenant of putting in the ceiling, putting in the raised floor, that's what you have to give back, not back to the shell and core, unless there's a very specific terms agreed, which I haven't seen any terms of those actually happening. And it's normally covered by way of rent-free period. That's how they get around it. So the tenant will get a 3-month rent-free towards the fit-out. It becomes the landlord's products at the end of the day.
Sorry, yes. See, when the tenant pulled over the things and repairs, they didn't have the money to complete the repairs, or enough money to complete the repairs.
Yes. I have seen broken men cry. I've seen fellas hitting 70 years of age, shops, nice little retail business, family businesses, getting away the very best for the last 25, 30 years, being hit by landlords with hundreds of thousands of euro of bills. And what happens, you can't take water from a stone, but so a landlord will take a judgment call as to how far they'll go. The reality is, a lot of big cases I'm showing you, that the landlord will go after a mark. If it's Bank of Ireland as the tenant, the OPW, they're going to get the money. These people have responsibilities to do it. If you're Joe Blogs with a liability of 50 grand, you might not be able to pay it. But if you had your 50 grand, it'll be taken off you. It's a frightening situation. Yes?
I suppose the key for the tenant is to have the schedule condition at the outset.
That's the absolute key to avoid these problems going forward. Yeah. Okay, thank you.